I'd like to welcome everyone out this evening and thank Will Bagley, my good friend, for sitting in with us and discussing his book and also books. I would like to be able to delve into some of the other books that Will has been involved with. But we're going to start out with what I think is one of the great books ever done when it comes to Mormon history, and that's Blood of the Prophets. It stands out among scholars of Western history, of American history, and there's not enough good things that can be said about it. So I'd like to turn the time now over to Will Bagley.
Well, I often think that the Mountain Meadows Massacre is like a little dog that yaps at my heels and I just can't get rid of him. But at the same time, it's been a real trial as a historical confrontation with facts and truth and what is truth. And in this case, what happened. And I believe that in many ways, I made the problem harder than it really is, because I should have started the entire work with the conclusions that Juanita Brooks came to in 1950. And she said, George A. Smith and Brigham Young created the social conditions that made the Mountain Meadows Massacre possible. And for me, that's the ball game. And once you establish the moral responsibility for an atrocity like this, that destroyed 120 lives immediately, and over the next 50 years destroyed another 70 or 80, who knows. But I think once you've established the moral responsibility, which I think is exactly what Brooks does there, everything else is inside baseball. It's one reason I love discussing the timing and the details and the insider's knowledge about how the Mountain Meadows Massacre happened with my Mormon friends. And they're always ready to defend the leader. and I've never felt that way about the Mormon Church. I thought the people are great, but the leaders, most of them want to be locked up, and many of them eventually are. But anyway, I think that's plenty to say about the Mountain Meadows Massacre. And I do have a confession as an author. I've noticed that historians often find themselves focused on one particular period or one particular character. And in my case, a lot of my work has taken place in the 1850s. And ironically, right now I'm working on volume 3 of my trail epic, which takes place when? During the 1850s. And it's really inspiring in many ways, because there's a film of me and Bill McKinnon up on the Mormon Trail and Highway 80, and the route which is the route that the U.S. Army came in 1857. Both of us spout a bunch of complete nonsense, and we've since debunked pretty much everything we say. But our understanding of what went on in the late 1850s in Utah had expanded terrifically. And Bill McKinnon, who is one of the most brilliant people I have ever worked with, has come up with the back history, the hidden history of the Utah War. And what was it about? It was about imperialism. It was about white people ruling the Western Hemisphere. And it was about how clever old James was going to use the Mormons to acquire big pieces of Mexico and to boot Cuba. This is absolute insanity, but that's what happened. And Brigham Young was going to uproot the Mormon people and move them to Mexico. And that would have been a bridge too far, one migration too many for most of our ancestors. But so it goes. And many of these wacky ideas are pretty well documented using the voices of the Mormon people themselves and the documents that come out of federal and LDS archives. And it's a great story. And I can't help but keep telling it over and over and over again. Maybe someday I'll get it right. Anyway, time for questions.
Yeah, well, there's a volume that you edited that recently was published. It was, I believe it was last October. It's called Whites Want Everything. It is the final volume of the Kingdom in the West series, which I think is one of the great Mormon series, one of the great series of the American West. And why don't you tell us a little bit about how that all came about? Why did you go sign on? How did that occur? All of those kinds of things.
Well, I set a goal in 1990 to be a professional historian in 10 years. And by circumstance, mostly involving Blood of the Prophets, I got professional status by 1995 and worked full time on the Mountain Meadows Massacre and Mormon History and the series that became Kingdom of the West. And I got the series because I submitted what became Volume 1 of the Pioneer Camp of the Saints, the 1846 and 1847 trail journals of Thomas Bullock, which were the official journal of the Brigham Young Company of 1847, and had never been published. And I was amazed that I was able to creep into LDS archives and make away with the crown jewels, which are these Pioneer Camp journals. And it was no doubt, it was far and away the most successful of all the Kingdom in the West volume. And both Bob Clark and I made some money on it, not a lot, but that's how you get by in both publishing and history. You make a reasonable amount of money, but you do the most interesting work and meet the most interesting people. And when Bob asked me to be a series editor, I really went bananas and sent out invitations to leading scholars in Mormonism. And we did get, in many cases, the very best qualified people who could have addressed polygamy, European visitors to the Mormon West. The variety of these volumes is pretty spectacular. And the editors are as diverse as could be. We have 2 Stake High Council members and the series editor. We have a former member of the Mormon Tabernacle Choir in the 1950s. We have a director of U.S. Steel and a vice president of human resources from General Motors among our distinguished editors. And I mean, these are people who I never had the slightest thought that I could possibly contribute anything to their careers. But they sure did contribute to mine. And I, I, I'm like all Americans. I dream that I'm going to be a big hit, get rich, and be a big success. But I never have been able to pull it off. And my calculations were not very good. I believed that by the time we completed all 16 volumes of Kingdom in the West, that the sets would be worth a lot of money. So I began buying copies and assembling them. And I've now got 8 or 9 of these editor's sets. And the trouble is, the audience for books by a quality company like Arthur H. Clarke, it was aging. And I could see this, and then the internet hits, and everything else goes to hell in a handbasket. And I made several serious mistakes as series editor. I went down and looked at how Leroy Hafen did the Far West and the Rockies. And he was a professor at BYU. And he would go and do a summer session. And he would have each of his students take a document and edit it for the series. And that's how he put together the Utah War, which is one of the classic assemblies of Utah War sources. And when we had McKinnon join the series with That Sword's Point, we sort of saw his book as being a supplement to Hafen, which it certainly became. But he had an assembly of editors, and he could stamp out these volumes one a year without any problem. And I had committed to doing a very long and involved set of volumes and working closely with each of the editors and spending years and years and years getting them done. And it went okay for a while, and we were able, during the first 10 years, to crank out a book a year or so. But that soon didn't keep its momentum up, and it was my fault. And I really wish I would have wrapped up the whole series by at least 2010. But some editors didn't finish their volume, and we had some hot things underway, such as Playing with Shadows, Voices of Dissent in the Mormon West, which was volume 13, and it was pretty close to the end, but it wasn't the end. And I'm still very proud of that volume. I think it's got great stuff in it. The contributions of Jeff Nichols and Polly Aird are simply spectacular. And it's got my favorite Mormon narrative, the life narrative of George A. Hicks, who was probably Utah's greatest, no doubt he is Utah's greatest pioneer Republican. But I need more questions if I'm going to keep talking.
Well, just a quick comment is Playing with Shadows. Lindsay Hansen Park of Sunstone has said it's her favorite book, not favorite Kingdom in the West volume, but favorite book altogether. She absolutely loves it and goes back to it all the time. You've done such a good job in this interview of talking about from this vantage point. And that's what's I felt in writing Mormon history would do, is allow the authors to look back on what they did. So
That's what happened.
I'm sort of curious what you think about writing Mormon history.
Oh, I love the book, and I really enjoyed many of the personal pieces because I know virtually everybody, every one of these people, and many of them are dear friends. And I found some truly excellent writing, especially Vicky and her piece about investigating James Strang and that tangled road that led her to completely change her belief system. Now, to me, that's a fundamental and very common story among Mormon historians. But she is such a good storyteller and such an excellent writer that she really drove home the emotional impact of it. And the book's full of surprises like that. And I must say, I learned, having tracked now Greg Prince's research methods and how thorough he is, that I'm just a slacker. I've often been praised for my research ability, but no, I'm just a lazy bum compared to people like Greg and Mike Homer. And that's another volume that I want to point out in Kingdom, which is Mike Homer's On the Way to Somewhere Else, because I'll often pick it up and every page has a new surprise. And I am not going to pick out a favorite volume, but I must say that On the Way to Somewhere Else is right near the top for me.
Yeah, every volume has something essential and important. And I know as I've read them, it's completely changed my reality for how the West was created. And that's my thanks to you for doing that. Uh, I'm sorry, Will, go on.
My encounter with Mormonism from the time I was a child was an encounter with institutional racism, and I really didn't like it. Um, but now, with volume 16, The Whites Want Everything, I've had to confront that legacy of racism, which survives in me too, and accept the fact that you can't escape the culture you're born in, the times you're born in. And I was born in a nation that was officially segregated. I was born in 1950, years before Brown versus Board of Education. And white supremacy was written into uh, government regulations, how loans were made, um, the obstruction of voting. Um, and I was fortunate enough to live through the civil rights movement, which I think, along with the gay rights movement, is part of the great chronicle of liberation. And Mormonism needs to embrace its revolutionary roots and go back to that sense of rebellion and opposing what is the profoundly disturbing racist nature of much religion, not just Mormonism, but take a look at the evangelicals who support the clown in chief. It's a reality that will have a hard time getting past the nation.
Well, this has been a fantastic interview, Will. I've really appreciated you taking time out of your busy schedule to do this. Um, I don't really have any more questions. Is there any final thing you'd like to say?
You've said everything I've got to say.
Well, thank you. I really
Oh, I
appreciate
do
it.
know. I do want to say thanks to my colleagues and the many people who've helped me assemble this series. The community of friends I've gathered among historians, and you two guys are definitely uh, a big part of that. And the colorful adventures we've all shared, uh, dealing with the history of America's most colorful crime family. Anyway, thanks to everybody.
Oh,
Talk to
thank
you
you.
later. Bye
Thanks,
bye.
Will.